What?
Nothing you. I'm talking about.
What?
Giving you some more room.
I'm going to need some mic space. Anyway, and I might need a slide change. The first thing I want to say is all three of these machines, Jay Miner, who worked at Atari and at Amiga, was my boss, my mentor, my good friend, and sometimes a square dancing buddy. I miss him terribly. In all cases of these machines, I worked in close collaboration with him. If you look up all the patents on my name, he's on many of them. When I started working for him, he said, "Success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan." Maybe the two of us were the first of several parents, but I'm representing a lot of people, not just me and Jay, but a lot of other people that I must confess as a middle-aged person no longer remember the names of. Sometimes I remember their faces. So I want to honor Jay's memory. Jay died 4 years ago, either this month or next month, of renal failure, after being the saint of the Amiga community and the Atari community. So I wanted to say that for Jay. The second thing is, many people have heard that this machine was called, the first machine was called Stella. And I'll tell the story because I have Exhibit A here. Okay. So I was hired in December of 1975. I'd been working in medical research. I knew in my previous job that it was Sunday because the newspapers were in color, because I lived in Surgical Greens in San Francisco. So I took this job at Atari because I was burnt out on surgery and intensive care. And I went to go work for Jay Miner. And we were going to work on this thing using this new processor, the 6502. And this was very early in the time of microcomputers. The Altair 8800 was just a year old. I had met Bill Gates the previous November at the Homebrew Computer Club where he came down to lecture us on software piracy. The Apple I was introduced in the previous year. The Apple II was a gleam in Steve Jobs' eye at the time. So we had this processor and you couldn't do development for it on it. It was too small. So we had to get a time-sharing service in San Francisco, and we dialed into it from Los Gatos. And I had a terminal, so I would key in things on the terminal and save it onto cassette tape, you know, the little things with tape on them. And then I would dial in and I would upload it at 300 bits per second and push some buttons and the thing would crunch and it would assemble my code, and I would download it into another cassette and load it into hardware. I needed a password. And I said, okay, Stella, no one's going to guess that. So that became the code name for the chip. And my boss said, that's a cool name. Let's use that for the product. So we had to rename the chip. And then marketing saw the name and they thought, cool, women's names. And every project after that at Atari was named after a woman, not knowing that that was, in this case, a bicycle.
Which says Stella on the side.
Right.
You've got to explain that. It's written on the bike.
Well, I'll hold it up in a moment.
Okay.
And so, and then the Apple people, Steve Wozniak had worked briefly at Atari. Steve Jobs had worked at Atari. They were still coming and invading our offices and picking our brains and picking our staff. And they picked up this habit. So they started naming things at Apple after women. And in the case of the Lisa product, it was named after somebody that Steve knew. And people liked that name so much that it became the production name of the product. It was the immediate ancestor of the Macintosh. So, anyway, that there. Hold that. This is the first public presentation of the old bike. It's real. It's not just a legend. And it still works.
Point to where the letters Stella are wearing off.
Yes. Well, maybe you can see it better on this side.
Yeah.
Right. I've taken this thing around Lake Sammamish this year. It's 30 years old. Anyway. So, let me get back to the point of this exercise, which is building entertainment machines. In 1972, Syzygy was organized, later to become Atari. They were thinking about different ways to do computer entertainment because Nolan Bushnell had worked in arcades back in Utah when he was younger. And they came up with a game that was called Computer Space. It had little objects moving back and forth, and you tried to thread this maze. Somewhere along the line, Nolan got a hint of the Magnavox Odyssey, and he said, aha. So he did a coin-op game called Pong, which had the objects bouncing back and forth. Is there anybody here in this room who doesn't know what Pong is?
Who's Nolan Bushnell?
Founder of Atari.
Okay.
I just added my signature to his signature on the unit in the display case. I'm honored by that. So Pong took off as a coin-op game. And the way they knew it was so successful is they put it in some bar in Sunnyvale, and pretty soon they got a tech support call. It had stopped working. They went out to troubleshoot the thing, and they discovered that it had stopped working because the coin box was completely full. It would not take another quarter, and they knew they had. Their first business, which is coin-op games, these big things in cases with built-in monitors and random logic, and they decided to try it and make more interesting games. And they started building ones with little bits of animation and little bits of playfield. That was successful too. With this success, they decided to enter home markets, bring this stuff home. So they hired some engineers, they built a chip, they built a case, plastic, controls, and they brought Pong home in 1975. That was a big success. They decided to complete the square. And the square was at home or in a bar, playing Pong, playing complicated games. And the square was to bring more complex animation home. For perspective, the first microprocessor came out in 1971, and the first 8-bit microprocessor came out in end of 1974, Intel 8080. Actually, the 8008 might qualify, but it was kind of crippled. Anyway, so the personal computer revolution was also starting to incubate in the Santa Clara Valley and the Homebrew Computer Club at the same time. But, so Atari, when they approached this, how do we complete this square? We know that people want to play these games so badly that they're willing to fill machines in bars with quarters. So let's bring it home. How do we do this? So one way they looked at it was to do the same kinds of random logic that they had done in coin-op. And the other was to see if they could use microcomputers to completely to make it flexible and programmable. And this unit here was the result. So in this particular case, I want to cover what the requirements were, what it's supposed to do. And it's, by the way, it's my observation that the most successful products start off with a clear vision of what you want to accomplish rather than, let's do this because it's cool. The design choices we made, the firmware, hardware trade-offs we made, the results, and the lessons that I would learn out of it. And then, two more. Okay. As I just said, we had a clear vision for the product. We wanted to bring those successful arcade pieces home. We wanted to hit $200 maximum retail price for the console for Christmas of '77. Given the economics of the time, we had to have a bill of materials of $65 or less. When we started that design process, the Intel 8080, an 8-bit microprocessor, in onesies cost $200. So we couldn't go that way, so we had to try out different approaches. We expected the product to introduce in '77 and maybe sell for 3 Christmases, by which time maybe we'd have slots for read-only memory cartridges that were between 2,000 and 4,000 bytes. That same $300 machine in the store can take CDs that are 700 million bytes, or DVDs that are 5 billion bytes as removable storage to bring in games. All those, let's see, the Xbox takes DVD cartridges, and that's how big they can be. So we're talking orders of a million, again, in the size of the things that you can shove into the box. And 2 game control ports, because games is where we live. Okay? Over there, I have some samples of what the controllers look like, though maybe a time to show that. Okay, from coin-op games, there were 2 obvious ways to architect the system. We could make it non-programmable random logic, which is the way Pong worked. Or we could try to use a microprocessor with a screen bitmap. Those are the 2 obvious things to do. Problem is, Random logic takes a long time to develop, a long time to debug, and if you got a bug, it's really hard to fix. You have to do a mask cycle, which takes 3 months. So you don't make market windows easily when you're doing random logic. Bitmaps are expensive. Keep going. So, the games that were appearing in the market at that time that used bitmaps used a lot more memory than we had in that machine. In fact, this machine here, at highest resolution, the size of the pixels there is about 128th of the width of the screen. If I was going to use all the memory that I just told you that I had in RAM, and we're going to map it onto the screen, I would get one row, 8 bits, 8 lines high, which wouldn't really cover the screen very well. So we needed to do something else to magnify the use of the little memory that we had. So the breakthrough that we had, Steve Mayer was the original architect working with Jay Miner. They proposed using a fast enough processor to reload the video on a line-by-line basis. In other words, we don't have a bitmap here. We have a list of things to display, which takes a lot less memory to save. And then we use that list to pull things out of ROM on the fly. So, hold that. And we had to wait for the right chip. The 8080 was too expensive and it needed 3 power supplies. The 6800 was too slow. The F8 was even worse. And the 6502, when it came out in September of '75, was perfect. It was fast enough, it was cheap enough, and it only needed 1 power supply. Why was it so good? Well, I don't know how to explain here why pull-up depletion load transistors are so cool, but they made the chips operated on data that was 8 bits, but the address was 16 bits. So if an instruction, the first byte, said pick up an address, the next 2 bytes. The 8080 was little endian, the 6800 was big endian. That means for the convenience of the engineers at Motorola, they said let's load the high address first and then the low address. And that means if you have to do any arithmetic on it, you have to load both bytes before you can do any logic. In the case of the 6502, you could load the first byte, start adding things together, propagating carries, add the second byte. So in the 6800, it took 4 clock ticks to do a conditional branch, whether you took it or not. In the 6502, it took 2 clock ticks to hit the conditional branch if you didn't take it, and 3 if you took it. And on average, you hit a conditional branch every 8 instructions. So things like that add up pretty rapidly. Plus, keep going. Being able to use the index pointers in memory meant that we could load up a pointer to the play field and pointers to these players and pointers to these players and load things out of ROM, read 2 whole K on the fly rather than having to work the whole thing into a bitmap and then just scan it. Design decisions. Any questions so far? I hope this is not completely mysterious. The coin-op games that were most successful at the time were little tanks driving around, shooting at each other, little airplanes driving around, shooting at each other, something with little basketball players hopping around and popping the ball somewhere, and paddle games and variations on paddle games. So we needed to prove, us in engineering in the beginning of 1976, that with our hardware we could do the same level of graphics. My job was twofold then. I was the assistant system designer, but it was my job to try to make the hardware do the things that marketing wanted us to do and prove it. And what I frequently discovered was, well, if I added a few transistors here, I made a lot of code go away. And if I added a little bit of code here, I can make a lot of transistors go away. So we could juggle until it all fit in technology that we could afford in 1977. So we decided we needed 2 motion objects, like these 2 cars. We needed a couple more 1-bit objects, like the bullets that fly out of the little tank to go hit the other little tank. And maybe a 3rd one, because we could make a paddle out of each of the motion objects. We could make paddles out of the 2 missile objects, and we could use the 5th motion object as the ball. So we could do 4-player Pong, because we thought maybe 4 people will get together and play Pong. When I blended families, a few years ago, and I had then 4 children. I pulled out of the garage a box with this cartridge, Video Olympics, and I saw my 4 children playing each other in 4-player Pong, and I thought that was so cool. That made my week. Okay, other chip features. Well, it has palette registers, and you can see here what the palette registers can do. What we noticed in coin-op is that a machine that sat in a bar for a long time would burn into pattern. And we knew that that was really going to annoy the people at home. So we first of all decided to use palette registers because we could have a lot more different colors in different games. And then something I came up with, and I wish I'd patented, was that when the thing is unattended, it keeps the same pattern, but it starts changing the colors. So each given cell on the screen goes through all possible colors, but in different order. So that if you were to burn in the screen, it would burn in rectangular. There would be no feature burnt in. If you were to leave that for days and days, you wouldn't have a little car there burned into your screen, you know, overlaying Oprah's face when you wanted to watch regular television. That would be a problem. So we had palette registers, we had collision detection registers, because it turned out to be very hard in software to figure out if this thing had touched this thing. So we had hardware to latch collisions every frame. We had 2-channel sound system, because there might be 2 cars, there might be 2 tanks. We did some various little tricks to generate various kinds of growling and whooshing and rushing noises, because those are hard to do in software. And we had crude volume registers, so you can make things louder, softer, with low precision. We had a couple of input ports to connect to the buttons on these guys. And we did make arrangements so that they could be used for light pens, but nobody ever made a successful game that did light pens. In fact, the 800 does the same thing and nobody bothers. Okay, graphics. All television sets use a 3.6 megahertz carrier for color information. And we use that for all the logic in the system, and we use it for clocking video as well. So these little things here, the minimum feature size horizontally is 1 color clock, 280 nanoseconds. It's very hard to put more finer grained information on a regular television, because if it's fast enough, the TV thinks that that's color information and not only notches it out from being able to be seen as luminance, but does very strange color effects. So I'm going to leave that. The motion objects can be variable sized. The playfield is 4 clock ticks per bit here. It's that clunky because reflected. So what's happening as this game is displayed is every 8 lines, 20 bits are written out by the processor. And the hardware displays it and reflects it. Reads it one way and reads it the other way. Keep going. How does the game work? Okay. This machine was successful partially because we could move some of the logic into software, which in that time with, you know, like if you go buy a processor today, you know, Pentium 4, whatever, it's got 0.1 micron features. When we made this, they were 10 micron features. So they were 100 times larger in each direction. So there was a lot less you could put on a chip in each direction. So what we did is the programmer has to be paying attention to what's going on all the time. He or she, and there were a lot of girls who wrote these games, had to know where the beam was with respect to where the processor was. So in vertical retrace, when the beam is off, the processor is looking at the game inputs, looking at the collisions that happened in the previous frame, and deciding what's going to happen next in the game. And then computes what the playfield is now going to look like if it changed, computing what the objects will look like and where they are. And having reached that point, it pops out, waits for the timer to time out, so it knows the right time to turn the beam back on, and then start displaying things. In this particular game, it's doing 2 different things. It's using playfield here to write scores, and then it changes the mode of the playfield and starts writing playfield and starts looking at a counter that it's keeping to decide, where am I on the screen? Shall I turn on this car now? Shall I turn on this car now? And writing the little graphics for those little cars, till it gets to the end of the screen. Does it all over again. That's all it does. Yep, and go ahead. So, we brought the thing out in June of 1907, Consumer Electronics Show. It was funny. I bought my first cheesy polyester three-piece suit because the marketing people didn't know how to demonstrate this stuff, so the engineers had to. Went to, that was in Chicago. We sold 250,000 units in the first year with 6 different cartridges. I don't think we need to remember what those are right now. So we had a successful year, although it wasn't as good as it could have been because we had some production problems. We could have shipped more and we might have made more money and had a lower return rate if we had had some luck in the production pipeline. So next year, Nolan said, we can sell 800,000 units. So they built 800,000 units. The retailers looked at their previous experience and they pushed them through the pipeline. They put an ad the day after Halloween for them, and within 3 weeks, Sears had completely sold out in California. You couldn't find one of these in California. And that particular winter was a very bad winter, and a lot of trucks couldn't get across country. So the retailers said, we're not going to get any more. Who cares? And so Atari finished the year with 250,000 units in the warehouse. So we doubled our sales volume and lost money. That's why Nolan left the company, is that Warner Management said, you're done. We continued to double sales annually all the way up to the market collapse in 1983. So they went up to $2 billion in sales in the 1982 Christmas season on this product before it collapsed. 50 million units total had been sold by the middle of the 80s, which is the last time I looked. There are things that you can buy in the store today that look like fat versions of this, that have a completely reduced version of the system right in here with batteries, little monitor out, so you can just sit here in front of your television or your monitor and play the game. It has probably 100 games in it in ROM. Yep. This here, I should probably buy one of these just for fun. Anyway, so the whole thing has been collapsed down into this. What do they charge for this thing? 30 bucks?
20 bucks.
20 bucks. Gosh. Moore's Law at work. Right, so this thing has a huge library of games built into it. I'm astonished and impressed. Okay, lessons. Make the hardware a flexible platform for clever developers. Okay, Bill Joy was a college buddy of mine at Berkeley who became the chief technical officer at Sun. And he told me and a lot of other people that you should design your business on the assumption that not all of the smart people in the world work for you. And several other companies have succeeded with that. So we were trying to make it cheap. But by putting a lot of the logic into software, we allowed the programmers to do a lot of things that we did not anticipate. You walk around this floor today, look at all those games. Those are doing things that we had no vision of when we started the project. Well, this, for example, for sure. Junior Pac-Man for another. We just didn't imagine that the programmers were going to be that clever. So make platforms so that other people can add value is the point. Good trade-offs between hardware and software made the product viable, because if we had tried to do what we originally looked at for a processor, a lot of the things that competed with the 2600 in the same time frame had bitmaps, and they were either too expensive or they had the wrong mix. Like, imagine a bitmap that was twice as good as this bitmap but half as good as this bitmap. So these objects would be much clunkier. Somewhere in my boxes in the garage, Deb, I have a Consumer Reports from fall of 1977, where Consumer Reports rated this the top unit for programmable games, both because we'd done the trade-offs correctly and the gameplay was better, and the other was it didn't burn in the screen and everybody else's machine did. So real marketing is essential, and what that means is that somebody in the company has a clear vision of who's going to buy it, why they buy it at all, and why they buy it from us. I've worked in other companies where the engineers thought it was their job to decide everything. Classic legends are about the engineers in the garage and they decide everything. Somebody in that successful organization has thought those questions, otherwise they're dead. Any questions before I move on to our second system? All right. We have some samples over there too. I might use them at some point. because one is an example of what we wanted to do. All right. Has anybody ever heard of a book called The Mythical Man Mind? Few of you. Terrific book. It's about software engineering. And one of the title essay is about how if you have a job, a programming job, let's say, and it's behind schedule and management decides to make it go faster by throwing more people at it, thinking that it'll make it go faster, frequently it fails. If the job is divisible, it may help. You know, if you have a whole bunch of people picking apples off of trees, more hands may make it go faster. But if you have a woman carrying a baby and you throw more women at it, it's not going to happen faster. It's not a divisible task. And some programming tasks are naturally not divisible. So if you throw more people out of them, those 2 people or those 3 people have to spend a lot of time talking to each other instead of writing code. And they're more likely to generate bugs because it's coming out of more than one head. And at some point you have so many heads on one project that it's going to be slower. Brooks argues that 6 people will do one programming task slower than 2 people will. And it'll cost 3 times as much or more. So they also have something called the second system effect. If you build something and you're successful, often to be successful it has to start spare and slim and simple. So the successful team now got to do our second system. And the danger of the second system is you throw a whole lot of stuff onto it that you don't need, really. But it distracts you and it eats up a lot of time to develop and debug and test. And then you're not sure whether the market really cares or not. And you may not succeed with that. And this was not an unqualified success like the 2600 was. We had split requirements, a dead giveaway of a problem. We were a company that did great games and a company that was watching the success of Apple and Commodore and other people selling computers, and we wanted to do computers too. So we had a split, we had 2 masters to serve. Jesus had something to say about that. So we wanted to, as gamers, support the best games that were around at the time in 1978, which were getting more complicated than the stuff that was earlier. And we wanted to support home computer characters and bitmap graphics. And the result was a common architecture and chipset that was packaged in 2 different ways. The one that you saw the picture of, that the sample is, was the 800, and it was a full computer. You could do word processing on it, you could do spreadsheets on it, etc., etc. Didn't have a hard drive yet, but nobody did in 1978. On the other hand, we repackaged it as a smaller thing. I don't know if we have a sample of the 400 here. It's got the same guts, it has a little flat panel keyboard, so you really wouldn't want to do word processing on it. You could play games that involved hitting keys to do this and that and the other thing, but only as a game, not as a, you wouldn't want to type anything large with it. You wouldn't even want to do email with it. But it had the same guts, it would run the same cartridges, it would run the same games on disk. Identical programming model. So, what's the requirement? Well, computers need keyboards. They need character graphics so you can see the results of typing. They need the memory to run the large programs. They need the memory to operate in larger data sets than 128 bytes. They need to be able to load programs and data from somewhere, from tape and or from disk. They need memory to be able to expand memory, because memory was on a steeply falling curve and you wanted to be able to make room to add memory. You wanted to be able to add peripherals. Go. Okay. Game requirements. We wanted to accelerate graphics manipulation. And we looked at what the programmers were actually doing in the 2600, which was making things change on the fly, change down during the screen. And we decided that instead of making a rigid bitmap, we would make a little engine that could manipulate bitmaps. We made an engine that had a display list that said, okay, on this line I'm going to do this, and the next line I could do this. So to generate 2600 style games on the 800 is really easy. It's not frequently done because they do more complicated stuff, but it's really easy. We wanted multicolored character maps so that we could develop a complex playfield without using a lot of memory. The same technique was used in the NES several years later. If you look at NES games, they have very elaborate displays, but you'll see a lot of repetition in them. because they make little... In the late parts of the 2600 development, we hired a programmer, what was his name? It'll come to me. Who did the Superman game. Anybody remember that one? We were just starting to do games that were not flying around shooting at something, but going through a series of scenes and interacting with the world in different scenes, different levels, if you will. That game style has become much more common. And we were just starting to see that. And we were starting to think that it would be cool to be able to move the whole play field smoothly. For example, there was a coin-op game coming out in 1978 called Superbug, and it had a relatively high resolution, a vertical view of a VW Beetle driving around a much larger virtual space, and then the TV was just windowing that. We used that as a test. I actually wrote a Superbug game just to prove that the hardware could do it. So we took a 6502 running a little faster. We built the Antic chip to do address generation and whatnot, and to reprogram the display on the fly. We did a chip that collected all the video out, what we call the CTIA. The GTI was George's version, the chip designer. Pokey meant pots and keys, that did all the non-video I/O. And we had another part for a bunch of parallel I/O, so that the original 800 had 4 complete game ports. You could play 4-player tank on that thing. In fact, it'd be pretty easy to write. That was another test program. You could put 8 different potentiometer inputs on the 800. So if you wanted to play 8-player Pong, if you were really, sort of like a 4-on-4 Pong soccer game, you could do it with that piece of hardware, and it would be very easy to write. We made sure that we never used less than 4K of RAM to start off with, which was, well, what is that? 64 times as much memory as the 2600 had. So in just from 1977 to 1979, the 2 machines went from 128 bytes to 8K bytes. We could do a lot different. We had, the 800 actually can take 2 ROM cartridges side by side. The later versions would only take 1 because nobody ever took advantage of that. All right, this thing has had the 5 motion object generators, 3 of which were 1-bit. The calling system could do 5 8-bit wide motion objects that were as tall as a screen, so they could be reused on the fly. So you could actually put a lot of different little animated creatures on the screen instead of just having to have the screen could be done by the hardware rather than by the programmer who is deciding what to happen next. It could do bit maps as high as 320 bits across in monochrome, so we could do 40 characters, each of them in an 8-bit wide map. You can't do better on a regular TV screen because the Foster resolution just isn't there. You could do 160 bits by 240 in 4-color, so you could do much richer play fields, and you could do character maps. And the palette registers had more color and luminescence, so they could get even prettier. All right, and to make things scroll, what the hardware winds up doing is, instead of generating a display of a fixed size, it generates a display of a larger size and then slides how it's displayed. I mentioned this already. If I had more time in my garage, I would have found the games that illustrate that. Okay. And the Pokey chip did 4 audio channels, so like if I had 4 controllers, I could have 4 sets of sounds for 4 different players. It supported 8 pot inputs, and it sampled the keyboard, so that you didn't have to do that in software either. This is more interesting. Let me grab an exhibit. And we wanted slots, hardware slots. But at the time, before 1979, the FCC has always regulated radiation generation, but they changed the rules over time. So this guy here, inside the box, there's a processor card and with chips on it, and there's an aluminum casting. It is completely shielded. If you drove a car over this thing, you'd be able to recover the chips out of it. The plastic would be crushed, but the chips would be okay. Because we had to meet what were then called Type 1 regulations. This thing here would hook up to a little box that goes on the back of your television set, hooking up with another lead that would go to the antenna on your roof. The FCC wanted to make sure that intentional radiators producing stuff in the TV band that looks like TV signals aren't leaking radiation out and drowning out your neighbors. So this thing here has an aluminum casting in here that is at least 2 millimeters thick. Radio hams love these things because they're so quiet from a radiation standpoint. Apple IIs at the same time were quite noisy. They didn't ship any units that had RF modulators in them because to do so would have subjected them to FCC Type 1 regulations, and they would have failed miserably. It wasn't until several years later in a hoo-ha involving Texas Instruments where the FCC changed the rules and started regulating devices even if they didn't drive television sets, and they relaxed the regulations on everything else. We would like to have built something like this where it had a place to plug in a box with slots. This machine was designed in 1979 after the rules changed. This machine was designed before. Because we couldn't do slots, but we wanted to have peripheral expansion, we had to do something else. What did we do? We did something that worked but was quite expensive. So this here, that's the serial bus. How many of you people know what the universal serial bus is? It's used on computers. It's either 12 million bits per second or 480 million bits per second. This is a lot like the USB, except it's, well, it was almost 20 years earlier than the USB and way slower. It was 20,000 bits per second. I'm going to show you a cable in a moment. Because we couldn't put a floppy drive controller in the back plane like Steve Wozniak could, we had to put a floppy drive in a separate box with its own little computer system. The computer system in here is more complicated than the one that does this. And that's in each drive. And we had these cables here to connect to this thing. So somebody buying an Apple II can get the same functionality for A, less money, because they don't have to deal with this added cost for every single drive. But it's a lot less trouble, because each one of these things needs another one of these cables, and it needs another verstunken power brick to plug into the wall, right? So if I wanted to have this guy, and, well, I was going to grab one of these too, and I was going to have another drive. This is a later design. So I'd have to have 2 of those cables and 3 of those power supplies. And if I want serial ports, printer port, I got to put another one of those cables on it and another one of those power supplies. Great game player, but a crippled computer by the RF regulations. So they could have slots. They didn't have to be wrapped in aluminum. We did. We had a serial bus. The peripherals were intelligent, but they were expensive. Let's go. So it sold well, but not near as well as the Apple for cost and convenience reasons. You know, people would buy it because it did better games, but they really needed an arcade piece, not a personal computer. They changed the rules in '79. Commodore introduced a machine that was structured like this, and it did real well because they could charge a lot less for it than you had to charge for a machine that was built inside an aluminum case.
What was the manufacturing cost comparison between the replacements? You know?
Well, probably 2 to 1. Part of it was mechanical, and part of it was the chip cost kept coming down. You know, like this one here shipped with 8K of RAM, and when I held it up, you could see that there was some slots in there, so that one had 48 in it. This one here had 64 meg as standard equipment. And it would still cost less to build. Now, Atari answered with the 800 XL, but it was kind of late. And they also repackaged it as a pure game machine, 5200. I don't know how well the 5200 did, but it certainly didn't take the market by storm. It was not, could not run 2600 games because it had a different architecture. And they later built a machine called the 7800, which could run 2600 games and better games, and I don't know how well it did, but neither of them were the big successes that the 2600 was. All right. So my lesson is, a personal computer has to have easy expansion with lots of room for third parties to add value, like the Apple II and like the PCAT family, which owns the world at this point. It appears to confuse things to sell a hybrid game console and a crippled PC. The 400 never did very well. If it was merchandised as a game console, it might have done a lot better because it played great games. It was bad luck that the FCC didn't change the rules until after the 800 shipped. This came out 2 or 3 years later than that one did. Something like the 1200 XL, which is a machine that was shaped like this, but had lower manufacturing costs and had built-in floppy drives. Might have done well if it came out in '79 rather than in '82, but I think at that point it was too late. So, any questions before I go on to the third generation? So, by 1982, Jay and I both left Atari in '79 for different reasons. Jay went off to design CMOS, externally controlled pacemakers for Medtronics. These things need to communicate. I had been reading about the Minitel system in Europe and in France, where it had taken off. And I was thinking that personal computers are not complete until they communicate as well. So I went and started a modem company, which is another story. So a few years later, Jay's gotten bored with pacemakers, and he's met Dave Morse, who was a marketing VP at Mattel, and they've got a concept for the next generation monster machine. They want to do animation. They want a machine that can do cartoons. And we built the machine that can do cartoons. And I was badge number 3. Jay's dog was badge 0. Jay was badge 2. Original product concept was to do cartoon quality our video games. Also, as a computer, it would have a built-in floppy drive for distributing games instead of making people make ROMs. And what happened was, when Amiga was founded in the fall of '82, that was, in fact, the peak of the 2600 market. And Amiga was going to raise less venture capital and instead do some products in the 2600 market as well. So they did something that allowed you to load games from a cassette into RAM plugged in. And they did some other little toys. And those didn't do very well because that whole market collapsed in '83 and '84. Atari was broken up into pieces and sold in '84. So Amiga was running out of money after we had done this fantastic chipset. So Commodore bought Amiga in 1984. And Commodore looked around, and the Macintosh had just been introduced. 68,000, same processor. And they had other machines pointed at the home computer market. And they didn't have any arcade stuff happening, and they didn't recognize the arcade market as a viable market because the Atari market had just collapsed, and Nintendo had not come over from Japan yet. So they decided it should be a color Mac, not an arcade machine. Big change in direction. So they did a color, true multitasking, multimedia operating system in 2 years. It cost them only 2 years, but it held it out of the market for 2 years, so it didn't generate revenue for a while. And they came out with the Amiga 1000, targeted as a computer. Okay, let's talk about that one. I have an Amiga 2000 over there, but that's next. So we used a modern processor, 68,000. If you change the microcode, the 68,000 could execute IBM 370 instructions. So it was a mainframe style processor on a microprocessor footprint. 32-bit wide operations, lots of registers, nice machine. Macintosh used, and its descendants use it. Okay, we assumed that people said more, and we didn't have to. And we figured that instead of putting ROM cartridges in, you put in 3.5-inch diskettes. But hard drives are too expensive to build in at the time. This was in '84. Okay. We wanted to do 40 characters on a TV, 80 on a monitor. Monitors are starting to become, especially monochrome monitors, are starting to become affordable given the explosion in the PC market. We wanted, the requirement for GUI, graphic user interface operating system, was glued on after we did the original design work. In fact, after I left. Okay, but gaming requirements. This is why you're here. Okay, we wanted hardware assist for the common graphics operations. We wanted to be able to change the hardware synchronous with the video beam, not only vertically but horizontally, which is a big deal. One of the members of the original design team had worked at Apple and had looked at Apple games, which were all bitmap because it had no motion object generation. So we not only had hardware assist for doing bit plane stuff and moving object stuff, we actually put in hardware assist for drawing and moving objects within a bit plane. We call that a bit blitter. We'll get there. So we could do foreground and background bitmaps. We could actually generate an 8-color bitmap and another 8-color bitmap and move them with respect to each other with hardware assist. So if you look at some much later Nintendo games, they'll have Mario moving around or something, and then behind that there'll be another thing moving in the background that'll give you the illusion of 3D. We supported multiple motion objects, multi-channel DMA audio, like instead of just saying, you know, make some little burps and whatnot, we could actually digitize the sound of a dog barking and play it at any speed. That was a funny demonstration. Load games from floppy. So amongst other things, this machine was powerful enough that if you had a hard drive bolted onto it, you could be a game developer with that station. So we made it a whole lot easier for a lot of people to be creative. That was our lesson from number 1, if you remember. So we had 4 LSI chips. We did 3 new ones besides the 68,000. We did something that did DMA generation and the BitBlitter engine. We did something that collected all the video stuff and mixed it up. We did another chip that did non-video I/O, including DMA for the floppy drives. We started off, the design assumed we would have at least 256,000 bytes of RAM. And we eventually shipped, the first unit shipped with 512. Remember, we went from 128 by a factor of 64 to 8K for the second generation. The original Amiga 1000 used the same game ports that all of these games do, so we leveraged that industry. And the floppy drive. Okay. So the primary display is a set of bit plane engines. We can, if we're doing one set, we can have 16 color with high resolution, or we can have up to 6 planes. We can have 2 planes of high resolution moving with respect to each other. It's pretty amazing. We had 8 sprite engines, 8 moving object generators. So in contrast, in the first generation, we have a couple of little 8-bit things that get moved around horizontally and vertically. In the second generation, we had 5 engines that were 8 bits wide by 256 bytes tall. And so we could move a lot of different objects at the same time if we were willing to change their positions on the fly. In the third one, the hardware itself would read the list, and each one of the 8 engines would read where the beam position of the first object would go, some random place, and then the graphics for it in 4 color, in 16 bits wide by 16 bits. So much finer than this, both in terms of color and resolution. And then after it displayed an object, it would read its next program, would say, go somewhere else and put another one. So you could program the Amiga to generate maybe 100 graphic objects all moving at once. You could put a crowd of things on the screen. And the palette registers would either give you 4 bits each of red, green, and blue, or they'd give you 4 bits of color, saturation, and luminance. And by saturation, the color people in the crowd, you know the difference between choosing sort of the hue of the color and then how intense it is, washing it out versus being very thick. That's what saturation is. Those are actually correspond to controls on television sets. So then there's this BitBlitter. So we had an engine and hardware other than the 68,000 that could take a bitmap and draw a line through it and fill the area. When you buy modern machines today, they have hardware assist for putting in polygons. This was the first polygon machine ever. I'm not aware of a polygon machine in the research area. This was the first machine that shipped that did polygons. So to make a polygon, you program it to draw a line, draw a line, draw a line, and then take that. And as it reads it, if it finds a bit, it propagates a bit and still it finds another bit. So it could take a drawn shape and then fill it in one operation. And if the cat had not chewed through my keyboard cable, I think I know which cat chewed through the keyboard cable, I would demonstrate on that Amiga over there a machine that's a flight simulator game from absolutely breathtaking. You fly under the Golden Gate Bridge if you want to in this jet. You can land on the aircraft carrier. You can buzz downtown San Francisco. And that was a 1984 machine. That's 20 years ago. And I already talked about the Sprite engine, so we can just pass that one. Okay, DMA audio. All right. First generation, you got 2 sound generators. They can do simple square waves or simple polynomial counters that make grump, 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 or psh kind of noises. Pretty simple. You really wouldn't want to use them to make music. The 800 had 4 channels. It had some shape control. You could do reasonable sounding 4-sound stuff with it. With the Amiga, you can take an 8K block of memory per channel and fill it with anything you want. Any of you who understand the arithmetic of chords know that you could digitize a full 3 or 4 note chord and put the composite waveform into the memory. And so you could do a whole chord of one instrument in one channel, and you have 4 channels. So you can do really nice sounding stuff with it. Have you ever heard of sampler synthesizers, where you sample a waveform and then you use it in various ways? The Amiga did that naturally. I don't know who all used it, but it would. Okay, keep going. The first version that we envisioned before Commodore took over would have physically looked like this, except it would have had a floppy drive on the side of it. It might have been a little bigger, but it would have been about this size. Integrated keyboard, so it would have a monitor out, it would have a place for a slot box, and it would have that. So it would be a nice arcade piece that also had a computer keyboard on it. And given the power of the operating system, or excuse me, power of the processor in it, we could have done a host development environment for it, so that you could have bought one of these things and written games for him and sold them individually or given them away or put them in the stores. Developers would have loved it. But Commodore had other ideas when they bought Amiga. So they repositioned it as a color Mac. It took 2 years. So it wound up being the thing that you saw a picture of earlier. And in the marketplace, so it came out into a market in 1986 with lots of competition. First of all, there was the IBM PC-AT and its clones, which really owned the computer as computer business. Then there was the Macintosh, which was monochrome at that point, but was the computer for the rest of us, with a much that the AT had. Windows was a long way off. And then there was the Atari St, which was structurally similar to the Amiga in terms of a lot of things, but it didn't have near the graphics. And it wasn't an arcade piece in disguise. Priced lower. So in that market, the Amiga didn't have, you know, what distinguished it. What it did capture a big share of a very small market, video processing. We had designed it so that it could synchronize itself with external video. Over there in the corner is a couple of machines that use video discs to make games. We designed the Amiga so it could synchronize itself with a video disc player or a videotape player and merge its graphics on top of graphics from some other place in real time. You could, in fact, have used it to overlay graphics on top of live television off your cable or off your antenna. And in fact, that's what they wind up getting used for. There was a simple add-on hardware called the video toaster. And Amigas with video toasters are still used in local TV stations today for video production, if you can find them. It was a cult favorite for a market failure. There's a few people out there in Fall City or someplace that have owned the logo and own what's left of the patent rights, and I don't know what they're doing, but they aren't making a lot of money. Lessons. Clear product focus matters a lot. Competent marketing people who are working with engineers who listen. If this machine had been allowed to come out as an arcade piece, I believe it would have renovated the video game market in the wake of the destruction left by the collapse of the Atari 2600 market. And in which case, I think the Amiga consoles would have been the big winners from the middle of the 80s instead of the NES. Because I believe that the Amiga machine does as much as, it's better than the Super Nintendo in terms of what it can do. I think that it isn't as good as the N64. The N64 came out, what, 98 something? 96. The Amiga console, if it had come out in 84, 85, would have been the class of the field until the early 90s. So I believe it would have owned the business. Anyway, I'm done. Any questions?
So is NES Nintendo Entertainment System?
Right, the first Nintendo.
Okay.
The one that took over the world after the collapse of Atari.
Right.
Yep. All right. I have some exhibits over there if anybody's curious, but I'm going to leave in about an hour, so I'll just leave them for a while. I have some objects to autograph, which are going to be prizes. I got out of Berkeley in '74 with a master's in biomedical engineering with a minor in double E in computer science, and I spent a year and a half doing medical research. And the medical research project I was on in San Francisco collapsed financially, and well, too many of the patients died without health insurance. It'd kill us. So I had to go find another job, and I was facing in the fall of '75 the choice between working in biomedical instruments area, where somebody who understood microprocessors was a hot commodity, or going to work for Atari. And it was one of those crossroads in your life. And I got two pieces of advice. My old buddy from Berkeley was telling me that, yes, you want to work on stuff that's socially relevant, like medicine, but most people are not healthy because they're not taking good care of themselves, not because we don't have enough technology. It's okay to go work in entertainment. And my father gave me the advice that if you're given a choice, take a job with a place that will teach you more than you already know. And to go off and work in the medical electronics businesses, I would be their microprocessor expert. Instead, I went to Atari, where I got taught to design chips. So I had a great deal of fun. I didn't make a lot of money, but it was a really rich experience. Peak experience for me in my life, of the top 10, you know, like getting married, birth of my son, those would be in the top 10. The fall of 1977, I went to a Sears store in Mountain View, California, and they had an exhibit of these things. First year, they're selling them. It's like the Thanksgiving weekend or something. And they've got them bolted to the table so they won't walk away. And there's a crowd of kids, you know, like 6 or 8 deep, waiting their turn to play the game. The games were simple enough that each kid in line got to figure it out by the time they got up to actually use it, and they'd all play. Families would come in. They'd leave their kids there.
And those were us.
Those were you. That's right. And your older siblings. Because this was '77, you know. I was 26, and many of you didn't exist yet. So the children are waiting in line, and they're having so much fun. And I'm standing there, I'm just thinking, wow, we've actually done something valuable. And then their parents would come by and try to pry them out of the store. It was really ugly. And I knew that generations of parents are going to be really angry with me. It's a good thing I wasn't on the cover of Time. I'd get beat up.
You hold several patents, correct?
I have 11. None of them that stood applied to the 2600. I should have been on the audio patent, and we should have filed one on the attract mode. I have 5 on the 800, which are probably...
If microprocessors were hard to come by back when you started the 2600, how did you redesign the 6502? I mean, did you just work with CMOS to get
No. The important redesign was done by MOS Technology, by Chuck Peddle. He realized the big Indian, little Indian thing. And he, like, the 8080 had a pair of H&L registers, and you had to do a lot of work to get a pointer into the H&L registers to then do anything through them. The 6800 had a 16-bit pointer register, and you had to do some work to get it loaded up, and then they did the indexing backwards. Whereas Chuck Peddle used the 6502, he added addressing mode so you could use pairs of memory locations as pointers in zero page. So suddenly, instead of having a single pointer register in the processor, I could go to zero page and I could have 100 of them. So as this thing flies down the screen, it's got a pointer register for the graphics for that, a pointer register for the graphics for that, pointer registers for these graphics. And that's a simple game. These things here probably have dozens of pointers. Those would not be possible with the 6800 or the 8080 architectures of the time. And what we did was simplification. It came in a 40-pin package. We got rid of 3 address lines. We got rid of the interrupts. So there's no interrupts in the system. It's challenging to program, but easy because you're not interacting. There's no other code running when your code is running. All you have to worry about is the beam position. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, who did the manufacturing? Was it actually Atari made it?
It was originally MOS Technology, and then Cinertech was licensed, and then Rockwell was licensed. So at peak, there were 3 different companies making them. And eventually, Commodore stopped paying MOS Technology, failed, so they bought MOS Technology, and we stopped buying them from MOS Technology. But we kept buying from Cinertech, and we kept buying from Rockwell. Rockwell hot-rodded the 6502. Most Rockwell/Connexent modems made for a very long period of time are descended from that 6502 core. You go buy a V90 modem today, it's from Connexent, it's got a 6502 running at 40 megahertz. More questions? Nope. Thanks, everyone.